I'm Trevor Stevenson, and this is Your Story Will Be Different. This is a narrative play podcast where I tell you the story that comes to be from playing a solo tabletop role-playing game. For this session, we're playing Ironsworn by Sean Tompkin. This is a dark fantasy RPG system that can be played solo, co-op, or as a full party. It's set in the brutal dark fantasy world of the Ironlands, where everyday life is impossibly hard. Your character makes what's called the Iron Vow, which is an unbreakable promise that sets the entire story in motion. But with that, let's dive right in. A light snow fell on the bodies strewn about the site of a battle in a makeshift settlement. One of them gasped for air after regaining consciousness. An ethereal voice hissed, "Kill," and an ebony sword plunged into the man's heart. His unseen assailant looked at the glistening black blade in his hand before dropping it to the ground. Nearby, an originally ornate, illustrated shield with two wyverns lay heavily damaged. The assailant dropped the black blade, picked up the shield, and left. High up in the bleak, rocky slopes of the Veiled Mountains, the mining hamlet of Ghostwalk gathered to discuss the recent retaliation against the raiders that had previously ransacked the village. One of the elders raised his hand to calm the group. He gestured for one of the survivors to speak.
Dag, can you tell us what happened?
Dag raised his bandaged head, but did not stand. We found the raiders' encampment half a day outside Olgard's stand. We used their surprise in our favor, but we were not without loss. He lowered his head again. Varg, Sindri, and Trim. A sad murmur rippled through the assembly. Gritting her teeth to fight back tears, Thora Kolddotir stepped forward.
And what of my father?
Kolfin fought valiantly. He and Varg were a force of nature, but I was knocked to the ground, and when I came to, your brother was dead and your father had run.
Liar,
she hissed. I was there, girl. What other explanation could there be?
My father probably saved your sorry hide while you were worming around on the ground. You could have been honorable enough to bury Varg.
Dag stood from his seat and looked down at Thora, his eyes burning into hers. He unwrapped a bandage to reveal to all of Ghostwalk the stump where his hand used to be. Thora reeled a little. It was challenging, girl. Be glad I was able to bring your family sword back. He pointed to the black-bladed sword leaning against his seat. As Thora's eyes landed on the weapon, something new stirred in the back of her mind. The elder spoke again as he picked up the sword and handed it to Thora.
As next in line, an eldest child in the Kolddotir family, grandson is yours by right. However, no honorable member of Ghostwalk would abandon his family and ancestral blade. Given Dag's testimony and the evidence given, it would appear that your father has abandoned his people and his position.
Thora looked up from the gleaming ebony metal in her hands.
What? No, he would never.
And as you know, the punishment for abandonment is exile for the remaining family,
the elder continued. Thora's heart raced. Her thoughts flashed to her mother and younger siblings. Her newest sister was just a few days old.
Please, you can't do this. My mother is still weaning. We won't last a week.
The elder paused, and Thora thought she saw a flicker of pity in the elder's milky eye.
You seem to need reminding that Ghostwalk was founded by exiles. We do not make this decision lightly. We are all we have.
If I find him and bring him back, Will my family be allowed to stay in Ghostwalk?
The elder nodded. Thora pulled the hand axe from her waist and held the blade of it between her fingers. The cold metal bit her fingers as she held it aloft for all gathered to see.
I make the iron vow. I, Thora Kolddotir, vow to bring my father back, dead or alive.
The elder stepped forward as he said the customary response to an iron vow.
So you are sworn. We will postpone your family's exile and wait until the next full moon for your return. Should you fail to fulfill your vow, you know what the punishment will be.
Dag stepped forward to Thora again. This time, he looked over her as if she was already dead. My advice would be to start with what's left of the raiders' camp outside of Olgar's stand. Stepping out of the longhouse, Thora's long sigh turned into a small cloud in front of her. A slight whooshing of wings preceded the familiar weight on her shoulders. Ugla, her owl companion, had been impatiently waiting for her on the roof. As Ugla passive-aggressively nipped at Thora's long braid, she petted the owl's feathers.
Father's really done it this time.
Ugla agreed with a low hoot. The next morning, as Thora prepared to leave, her mother chastised her for this reckless decision. Thora rebuked, saying that her remaining siblings needed their mother's help if Thora failed. She took her mother's hand and assured her that her failure would only come if she was dead, in which case her mother would have one less child to worry about. She grabbed her shield, sheathed Grandson, and took one last look at her home before she set off to find her father. She etched the details of her home in her mind. The gray shale running down the mountain, silver wisps of clouds, a winged, writhing mass swimming through the air and clouds in the distance. As Thora arrived at the ruins of the raider settlement, she saw crows feeding on the bodies of the fallen, those from Ghostwalk and raiders alike. Ugla scared off the crows as Thora examined several of the dead. A rattling sound from one of the ramshackle tents caught Thora's attention. Swinging her shield to one arm and filling the opposite hand with her axe, she stepped closer. The blonde woman stepped out chewing some jerky. Even underneath the dirt on her face, she was still shockingly beautiful. Thora asked why she was picking over the remains of the raiders, and the woman introduced herself as Tessa, and replied that one of the better-looking bandits had promised her baubles and drink if she would be his. Tessa hadn't gotten a chance to confirm before the posse from Ghost March came through for revenge. Swallowing her revulsion, Thora asked if she had found her father. Tessa dismissively said no, as she rolled over another body. Thora's brother. Thora pointed her axe at the woman and ordered Tessa to step away. Tessa produced a hammer as she told Thora that she was entitled to her own recompense. Thora gritted her teeth as the standoff over her brother's body was interrupted as Ugla swooped down, startling Tessa, and allowed Thora to easily knock the hammer out of her hand. Thora said that Tessa could take what she needs but stay away from her brother. Tessa grumbled as she gathered some food and furs. At midday, Thora sat next to the pile of rocks where she had buried her brother. As she picked herself up to move on to Olgar's stand, she examined her father's sword. It was then that she heard a voice in her head.
Daughter of Coldfin, no mercy, no weakness, only victory and the sweet scent of death. The weak cling to their morality, but you are destined for greatness. Wield me and claim your throne.
The voice introduced itself. Grandson was sentient and had been passed down for generations of her family, guiding them for the last 100 years. When her father absconded, Thora became the leader of the family, and thus, Grandson was hers.
True power lies in the absence of restraint. Soon, you won't be able to tell my voice from your own.
Why did my father abandon you, Gramson?
I whispered to him just as I do to you. I showed him how he could rule the Ironlands, the enemies he could crush beneath his heel. Yet he faltered and dropped me as if I were some cursed relic rather than the key to his ascension. All he did was prove his own weakness. He was nothing without me, and now he wanders the world, a shadow of the warrior he could have been. I offered him everything. Power, glory, and he threw it all away for the hollow comfort of his fragile conscience.
Despite the cutting remarks from Dag and the evidence of the raider camp, Thora still didn't believe her father to be a coward. She sheathed the sword as she continued on her quest. Olgarstan was a rugged Viking settlement perched on the edge of a harsh and unforgiving landscape where the cold winds howled. The center of the settlement housed the Chief's Lodge, a large, imposing structure made of thick timbers and reinforced with iron bands. The lodge was dark and weathered, marred by smoke stains from countless fires that had burned within. The narrow dirt paths between the buildings were well trodden, lined with piles of firewood and the occasional broken cart. Wooden palisades encircled the settlement, with watchtowers at strategic points, manned by weathered but vigilant sentries. Given recent events, it wasn't surprising that the community was in the crossfire of various settlements and the now destroyed raider party. Other settlements saw Olgarstan as being responsible for the damages to their communities since they had abetted the raiders. Angry villagers from other settlements queued up in front of the chief's lodge to demand reparations. Knowing she wouldn't make any headway there, Thora avoided the belligerent line outside the chief's lodge and ventured over to the local watering hole. It proved to be a dimly lit and smoky tavern that buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of tankards. The wooden beams overhead were thick with age and soot, and the scent of stale ale mixed with the earthy aroma of wet wool. As she pushed through the heavy wooden door, her eyes scanned the room, searching for any familiar faces, anyone, who might have seen her father. A few eyes glanced up at her as she entered, but most quickly returned to their drinks and discussions. In the far corner, she noticed a group of men huddled around a table, their laughter subdued but noticeable. One of them, a quirky red-nosed local with a mischievous grin, caught her gaze and waved her over. "Join us," he called out, his voice slurred slightly from mead. Thora hesitated for a moment before nodding. She sent Ugla up to the rafters to keep an eye on the room from above. The bird fluttered silently up to its perch, using its large amber eyes to scan through the dim light of the tavern. Thora then approached the table and took a seat across from the man who had beckoned her. His cheeks were flushed, and his nose was a vivid red, complementing his sickly sweet breath. "Not often do we get new faces around here. Name's Hennian, advisor to the chief, at your service." Thora raised an eyebrow, surprised to find someone of his status in such a place.
Shouldn't you be at the chief's side, Hennian? What are you doing here instead of advising him?
The chief can handle himself. I never much liked the idea of aiding those raiders. Always said it would come back to bite us, and now it has, hasn't it? Olgarstan is in chaos, and I'm letting him deal with the mess he's made. My advice was ignored, so what's the point in sticking around now? Thora frowned and leaned in closer, lowering her voice.
Did any of the raiders survive?
Hennian shrugged. Who knows? I didn't stick around to find out.
Were there any survivors brought back to Olgarstan for aid?
Maybe, maybe not. As Thora clenched her fist under the table, she felt a cold presence at her side. Gramson, and a dark whisper echoed in her mind, urging her to act.
Put me to his throat.
Thora's grip tightened around the hilt of the sword at her side. She struggled to keep her composure, fighting back the violent impulse that echoed loudly in her thoughts. She forced a smile, though her hand twitched involuntarily. She did her best to reject the blade's impulse, trying to appear calm and collected, despite the sword's dark influence whispering in her mind. Gramson admitted.
Fine. Drink him under the table.
An hour later, the tavern was filled with Henion's loud, slurred ramblings as he blabbed his whole life story. The others that had been seated with him were long gone, having been driven off by the advisor's booming voice, full of unfiltered thoughts and half-forgotten tales. Thanks to her father and brother's habits back in Ghostwalk, Thora had kept pace drinking with the fool, but now struggled to keep the horizon level and fought the rising wave of nausea threatening to undo her. She tried repeatedly to steer the conversation back to her original question. Henion's mead horn wobbled precariously in his unsteady hand, and Thora found herself juggling her curiosity with the desperate need to keep herself from regurgitating. As Henion raised his horn once more, his bleary eyes caught sight of Thora's shield leaning against a column of the row house. The intricate carvings of wyverns, depicted in what looked like a fierce dance, seemed to catch his attention even through his drunken haze. "That yours?" Henion slurred, pointing a shaky finger at the shield. Thora nodded lazily.
Mm-hmm.
"Are those wyverns dancing?" Thora grinned.
We hail from the Veiled Mountains. We've seen a wyvern or two.
"So you're miners. Tough lot you are, then," Henion said, his tone a mix of respect and surprise. He shuffled in his seat, suddenly more serious as he recalled something. "You know, I saw a man less than a week ago with a shield like that. Gouged, slashed, and missing a third of it, though. Looked like it was cut clean off."
But he was alive?
"Looked barely better than his shield, but yes, he was alive."
Where is he?
"Last I saw," Henion muttered, his words beginning to blur together, "he was laid out on a cart. A caravan cart. Headed to the hinterlands." If her father was alive, there was a chance to find him, but the road ahead would not be easy. "You'll need passage through the Tempest Hills. Stunted forests, howling winds, slippery, mist-shrouded waterfalls. Going on foot? Perilous. Exhausting." He paused to take a long swig of his drink, but his grip slipped and he nearly dropped the horn. "And if you survive, you'll need a guide through the hinterlands, or else you'll be lost in the dense forests and eaten by beasts. Hungry beasts." Thora's head spun as she absorbed the words, and the room tilted dangerously. Before she could ask any more questions, Henion's head slumped forward, and with a loud snore, he passed out on the table, leaving Thora alone with her thoughts. The next morning, Thora set out into the lands she had never seen before, the memory of Henion's words and the image of her father's face rattling in her mind. The landscape gradually shifted to more treacherous and wild terrain. Days passed as she trudged onward, the environments less hospitable with each step. Several days into her journey, Thora found herself at the edge of a cold marsh. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a bone-chilling fog hung low over the stagnant water, which curled around the twisted, lifeless trees that stood in the mire. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only a dim twilight that seemed to stretch endlessly, refusing to give way to full darkness. The marsh was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant croak of a frog or the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the water. Thora set up a small camp on a rare patch of dry ground, her muscles aching from days of relentless travel. She huddled close to the small fire she managed to kindle, but its warmth was barely enough to chase away the cold. Thora pulled her cloak tighter around herself, willing herself to sleep, but knew deep down it would be a restless night. As she stared into the flickering flames, Graham's son began to whisper. The ancient sword slithered through her thoughts, planting seeds of doubt and violence. It spoke of the blood that had yet to be spilled, of the enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting to be cut down by its edge. Thora squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the blade's insidious words, but they seeped into her consciousness like poison before sleep finally came. The next leg of her journey brought her to the base of a great hill, where she finally spotted signs of civilization. A caravan was gathered at the bottom of the hill, but one of the carts appeared to have suffered a broken wheel. The merchant's breath was visible in the chilly air as they struggled to make repairs. Thora approached cautiously, her hand resting on the handle of her axe as she drew near, but one of the merchants waved her over. Jagar was a wiry man with a friendly disposition, and his easy smile and warm greeting were a welcome change from the solitude of the past few days. After exchanging pleasantries, Thora got to the point, asking if the caravan had seen anyone matching her father's description. Jagar nodded, his face lighting up with recognition. Aye, we had a man with us. He called himself Kendi. Tough old bastard, seemed to know his way around, but he parted ways with us just yesterday. Said he had somewhere he needed to be. Listen, if you help us with these repairs, I'll make sure you get to the closest settlement to the hinterlands. From there, you might be able to pick up his trail. Without hesitation, Thora agreed, rolling up her sleeves and joining the merchants in their work. As the hours passed, they made steady progress, the wheels slowly being replaced under their combined effort. Thora felt a sense of purpose in the physical labor, but just as they were finishing up, the air was suddenly filled with a sinister whistle. Arrows rained down from the ridge above, embedding themselves in the wooden cart and the ground around them. Shouts of alarm echoed through the camp as the merchants scrambled for cover, abandoning their work to take shelter behind the carts. Thora's instincts kicked in, and she swiftly grabbed her shield and axe. The masked marauders descended upon the caravan with ruthless intent. They were after the goods, and they didn't care how many lives they had to take to get them. Thora's heart pounded as she charged into the fray, her shield raised to deflect arrows as she barreled towards the attackers. Rage bubbled inside her, a fierce, hot anger that she had been holding back for days, and the battle was her release. A chance to finally unleash the fury and frustration that had been building within her since she left Olgar's stand. She met the raiders head on, her axe cleaving through their ranks with brutal efficiency. Gramson hummed with belligerent satisfaction at her side, urging her on. She fought with a ferocity that left the raiders reeling, cutting them down one by one until only a single marauder remained. Sensing defeat, the last of the raiders turned and fled into a nearby forest of stunted, gnarled trees. Not willing to let the threat escape, Thora called to Ugla, who soared overhead, tracking the fleeing figure from above. With the owl guiding her, Thora pursued the raider into the dense forest. The trees closed in around her, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. The sound of her own breathing was the only noise as she stalked her prey. Finally, she cornered the raider, pinning them against a tree with her shield. The raider struggled, but Thora's strength was too much. Without thinking, she drew Gramson. The raider began to beg for her life, the voice muffled by the mask, but something about it struck deep within Thora's memory. Narrowing her eyes, Thora reached out and tore the mask away, revealing the familiar face beneath it. It was Tessa. Someone she had never expected to see in such a place. Gramson's voice hissed in her mind, urging her to strike to end Tessa's life without mercy.
Kill her,
the voice demanded.
She will only follow you, hunt you for what she desires. Me. End her now, before she becomes a greater threat.
Thora's hand trembled as she held the blade to Tessa's throat. She could feel the sword's dark desires coursing through her, filling her with a nearly overwhelming urge to obey. She looked into Tessa's terrified eyes. With a deep breath, Thora made her choice. With swift, brutal precision, she delivered a series of punishing blows, knocking Tessa to the ground and leaving her battered and bruised.
You were lucky I'm not as far gone as this world would have me be. But if I ever see you again...
Her threat lingered in the air as Tessa nodded. Gramson seethed in her mind, its disappointment almost palatable. Leaving Tessa crumpled on the forest floor, Thora sheathed Gramson and turned back towards the caravan. After riding with the caravan for several days of arduous travel, Thora found herself at the settlement of Timberwall, perched on a ridge that overlooked the vast, mysterious expanse of the hinterlands. The settlement was crafted from the same dark, knotted wood that stretched endlessly into the forest below. The walls of the settlement were made from massive timber logs, which were clear evidence of the dangers that lurked in the wilds beyond. As she approached the gate of Timberwall, Ugla swooped down from the sky and landed eagerly on her shoulder. Her talons were light but firm, and Thora could see her eyes gleamed with anticipation. Ugla seemed to sense the secrets hidden in the forest below and was eager to explore the shadowed paths and forgotten places. Thora, however, felt a chill run down her spine as a distant howl echoed out from the depths of the hinterlands. The eerie sound was soon met by similar, more distant calls, reverberating through the hills like the haunted cries of lost souls. The buildings inside Timberwall were functional and built to withstand the elements, with steep roofs to shed the frequent rains and high walls to keep out the predators that roam the forests. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy smell of freshly cut timber. Thora's boots crunched on the gravel paths as she moved through the narrow streets inquiring about a man calling himself Kendi. The villagers were initially wary, but after seeing the determination in her eyes and the weariness in her stance, directed her towards someone who might know, a trapper named Zura. Zura proved to be an older man with weathered skin and a face marked by a life spent outdoors. His eyes were still sharp, though, and he listened intently as Thora described her search for her father. When she mentioned the name Kendi, Zura's expression changed slightly, a hint of recognition flickering in his gaze. I've encountered a man by that name. Met him deep in the hinterlands, where few sane folk venture. He seemed out of place, a man with no business in those parts, but he was determined, that's for sure. Said that he was searching for something. Ruins under the roots, he called it. Thora's brow furrowed at the strange phrase.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with that. What does he mean by ruins under the roots?
Zura leaned back, crossing his arms. Most likely he was talking about the fabled ruined city. Some say there's a place in the hinterlands, a hill covered in towering trees, ancient and twisted. The stones there, they're not like anything you'll see elsewhere. They're unnaturally shaped, almost as if they were carved by hands long since turned to dust. They're concentrated on one side of the hill, and if you're not careful, you might think they were just rocks. But those who know see the patterns, the signs. He paused, his gaze growing distant as he recalled the dangers. That part of the hinterlands is fraught with mortal dangers. Beasts that don't shy away from human flesh, traps laid by the land itself, and spirits that linger. They don't take kindly to trespassers, Thora nodded.
Thank you for the information.
If her father had gone there, then so would she. The ruins under the roots might hold answers she sought, but they would also bring her face to face with dangers that had claimed so many others. As she turned to leave, Ugla let out a soft hoot, as if sensing the gravity of the journey ahead. Thora gave the bird a gentle stroke before looking out towards the dark, tangled expanse of the hinterlands. there for now, but we will conclude her story next time. My very special thanks to my friend Meggan Amos for providing the voice of Thora Kolddotir for this story. If you're interested in more things that Meggan's up to, she just finished the first season of the Ghost Show podcast over on your preferred platform. Go ahead and check it out there. I'll put a link in the show notes to various other projects that Meggan's working on. And of course, you'll hear more of her as Thora in our next session. If you're fascinated by the concept of Ironsworn and its mechanical system, there is a podcast that is perfect for you. It's called Ask the Oracle, and it features the creator of the Ironsworn system, along with his son, as they build characters and start a campaign in the Ironsworn system. Feel free to reach out on social media platforms at YourTTRPG on X and Instagram, and let me know how your adventures are going with Ironsworn or any of the other systems we've checked out. I'll put a link in the show notes to Ironsworn so you can check it out for yourself, but just remember, your story will be different.